She had the kind of life that moved quietly, almost unnoticed by the world around her. Every morning began the same way, with the soft sound of an alarm that she never let ring for too long. She would wake up before the sun had fully risen, sit on the edge of her bed for a moment, and gather her thoughts. There was no rush in her movements, no sign of excitement or dread, just a calm, steady rhythm that had become part of who she was. Her room was small but neat. Everything had its place and nothing felt out of order. A simple bed, a chair near the window, and a small shelf with a few old books. There was also something else, something that most people would not notice right away. Tucked in one corner, covered carefully with a cloth, was an old keyboard. It wasn't new or polished. In fact, some of its keys had faded, and a few didn't work as smoothly as they once did. But she kept it clean, almost like it still meant something important. She didn't touch it often. Life had a way of filling her days with other responsibilities. Long hours at work, small tasks that never seemed to end, and the quiet pressure of just getting through each day. She worked in a place where people came and went quickly, where conversations were short and often forgettable. Most people didn't stop to notice her. She was polite, kind, and always did what was expected, but she stayed in the background. And maybe, in some ways, she had grown used to that. There was a time, though, when things were different. Years ago, before life became so heavy, she had discovered music in the simplest way. It wasn't through lessons or expensive classes. There had been no teacher guiding her hands or correcting her mistakes. It started with curiosity. A borrowed keyboard, a few notes played by chance, and a feeling she couldn't quite explain. Something about the sound made her pause. It felt like a quiet escape, like a space where she could breathe more freely. At first, she didn't know what she was doing. Her fingers would press the wrong keys, and the sound would feel uneven. But she didn't stop. Night after night, when the world around her grew quiet, she would sit and try again. Slowly, the sounds began to make sense. Simple tunes turned into soft melodies. And those melodies began to carry emotion. She never told anyone about it. It was her own small world, something she didn't want to explain or share. Maybe she thought people wouldn't understand. Or maybe she just liked that it belonged only to her. But life doesn't always leave space for quiet dreams. As time passed, responsibilities grew heavier. There were days when she came home too tired to even sit down, let alone play. Weeks went by, then months. The keyboard stayed in the corner, covered and untouched. At some point, she stopped thinking about it altogether. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Because sometimes, late at night, when everything was still, she would hear music in her mind. Soft notes, familiar patterns, like echoes of something she once knew well. She would pause just for a moment and listen, but she never moved toward the keyboard. Instead, she would turn away and let the feeling pass. It was easier that way. Her days continued in the same steady rhythm. Wake up, get ready, go to work, return home, rest, and repeat. There was nothing wrong with her life, but there was also nothing that stood out. It was simple, quiet, and predictable. People around her talked about their goals, their plans, and the things they wanted to achieve. She listened, sometimes with a faint smile, but she never joined those conversations. Not because she didn't have dreams, but because she had learned to set them aside. Dreams, after all, can feel distant when life demands something else. Still, there were small moments that hinted at something deeper within her. Like the way she would pause when she heard music playing somewhere nearby, or how her fingers would lightly tap against a surface, almost as if they were remembering something on their own. These were quiet habits, easy to miss, but they were there. One evening, after a long and tiring day, she returned home later than usual. The streets were quieter, and the air felt cooler. When she stepped into her room, she didn't turn on the main light right away. Instead, she walked toward the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the stillness outside. There was something different about that night. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a slight shift in her thoughts. Not a big change, just a small feeling that something was waiting. She turned her head slowly and looked toward the corner of the room. The keyboard was still there, covered, quiet, and exactly where it had always been. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at it. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar, like looking at something from a different time. She took a step forward, then stopped. A part of her hesitated, unsure of what she would feel if she got closer. But then, without thinking too much about it, she moved again. Her steps were slow, careful, as if she didn't want to disturb the silence. When she reached the keyboard, she gently pulled the cloth away. A thin layer of dust had settled on it, but it still looked the same. Still simple, still worn, but still hers. She sat down. For a moment, she didn't do anything. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes stayed on the keys. It had been so long that she wasn't sure if she even remembered how to play. The thought made her feel uncertain, but something deeper pushed her forward. She lifted her hands and placed her fingers lightly on the keys. The first note came out soft, almost unsure of itself. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even smooth, but it was enough. She paused, listening. Then she tried again. Another note, then another. Slowly, a pattern began to form. It wasn't complicated, just a simple tune. But as she continued, something began to shift inside her. The hesitation faded, and her fingers started to move more naturally. Felt familiar. Not in a way that brought excitement or surprise, but in a quiet, steady way that felt like coming home after a long time away. She didn't play for long. Just a few minutes, maybe less. But when she stopped, the room felt different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It carried something warm, something alive. She looked down at the keys, then gently covered the keyboard again. That night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts didn't feel as heavy as usual. There was still the same routine waiting for her in the morning, the same responsibilities, the same quiet life. But now there was also something else. A small spark. Something that had been silent for a long time was beginning to wake up again. She didn't know where it would lead. She didn't even know if it would matter. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't push it away. And somewhere deep inside, without saying it out loud, she allowed herself to wonder what might happen if she didn't let it fade this time. The next morning felt almost the same as every other morning, yet something inside her had quietly shifted. When the alarm rang, she opened her eyes before it could sound again. For a brief second, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, as if trying to hold on to the feeling from the night before. It was faint, but it was there. A soft reminder of the few notes she had played. She sat up slowly, her movements calm as always, but her mind was not as empty as usual. There was a thought lingering in the background, one that refused to fully disappear. The keyboard. She didn't rush to it. In fact, she didn't even look in its direction. Instead, she followed her routine. She got ready, stepped outside, and made her way through the familiar streets. The world around her moved at its usual pace. People walking quickly, voices blending into noise, vehicles passing by without pause. Everything looked the same, but she noticed more than usual. As she walked, she passed by a small shop where soft music played from inside. Normally, she would walk past without thinking twice. Today, her steps slowed for just a moment. The melody wasn't anything special, just a simple tune, but it caught her attention. Not because it was perfect, but because it reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. She stood there for a second longer than necessary, then continued walking. At work, nothing had changed. The same tasks waited for her. The same people moved around her, busy with their own routines. Conversations were short and simple, just enough to get through the day. She responded politely, just as she always did. No one noticed anything different about her. And why would they? From the outside, everything was exactly the same. But inside, there was a quiet restlessness. It didn't distract her from her work, but it stayed with her, like a soft voice asking a question she wasn't ready to answer. As the day went on, she found herself thinking about the keyboard again, about how it had felt to press those keys after so long, about how something so small had made her feel different. She didn't understand it fully, but she didn't ignore it either. By the time the day ended, she felt a strange mix of calm and curiosity. When she returned home, the room welcomed her in the same quiet way. Nothing had changed. The chair was still by the window, the shelf untouched, and the keyboard rested in the corner, covered as always. She stood near the door for a moment, looking around. Then, almost without thinking, she walked toward the keyboard again. This time, she didn't hesitate as much. She pulled the cloth away and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not as unsure as before, but still careful. She took a slow breath and began to play. The sound was soft at first, uneven in places, but it didn't stop her. She didn't try to play anything complicated. Just simple notes, one after another. But as she continued, the same feeling from the night before returned. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about feeling something real. Minutes passed without her noticing. The outside world faded, and for a short while, there was only the sound of the keys and the quiet rhythm of her breathing. It felt natural, like something that had always belonged to her, even when she had pushed it aside. When she finally stopped, she didn't feel tired. She felt lighter. That evening became different from the rest. She didn't rush to finish her usual routine. Instead, she allowed herself to sit there a little longer, just thinking. Not about work, not about responsibilities, but about something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in a long time. What if she didn't stop this time? The thought came quietly, but it stayed. The following days began to change in small, almost unnoticeable ways. She still woke up early. She still went to work and completed everything she needed to do. From the outside, nothing had changed. But every evening, she returned to the keyboard. First, she played only for a few minutes. Then those minutes slowly grew longer. Her fingers began to move more confidently. The hesitation faded little by little. Old patterns returned, and new ones formed. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that she didn't stop. There were moments when she made mistakes, when the notes didn't sound right. But instead of feeling frustrated, she simply paused and tried again. There was patience in her approach, a quiet understanding that she didn't need to rush. She was not trying to impress anyone. No one was watching, and maybe that made it easier. One evening, as she played, she didn't notice that the window was slightly open. The soft sound of the piano drifted outside, carried by the cool evening air. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The passerby slowed down for a moment, listening briefly before moving on. She had no idea. Inside the room, she continued playing, completely unaware that her music had reached beyond those walls. For her, it was still something private, something personal. A quiet part of her life that no one else needed to see. But the world has a way of noticing things when you least expect it. A few days later, something unusual happened at her workplace. There was a small announcement made during the day. It wasn't anything serious, just a casual mention of an upcoming local gathering. It was meant to be simple, a way for people to come together, share small talents, and enjoy a light atmosphere. Someone mentioned that there would be a piano available. Anyone could try playing. Most people didn't pay much attention. Some laughed, others made small comments, but no one seemed particularly interested. It was just another activity, nothing important. She heard it clearly. Her hands paused for a brief second as she worked, but she didn't look up. The conversation continued around her, fading in and out, but the words stayed in her mind. Piano. For a moment, she felt a small shift in her chest. Not fear, not excitement, just something in between. A feeling she couldn't fully understand. She quickly pushed the thought aside. That wasn't her place. Events like that were for people who were confident, people who wanted to be seen. She had spent most of her life staying in the background. Stepping forward like that didn't feel natural. So she said nothing. The day continued, and soon the conversation moved on to other things. But the idea didn't completely leave her. It stayed somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet but present. That evening, when she returned home, she went straight to the keyboard again. This time, her playing felt slightly different. There was more emotion in it, more depth. It was as if her thoughts were finding their way into the music. She played longer than usual. At one point, she stopped and looked down at her hands. There was a question forming in her mind, one she hadn't allowed herself to ask before. What if she tried? She didn't answer it. Instead, she gently closed the keyboard and sat back. The room was quiet again, but her thoughts were not. The idea of that small gathering, that simple opportunity, stayed with her. It wasn't about being seen. It wasn't about proving anything. It was just a chance. She lay in bed that night, staring into the darkness, thinking about something she had avoided for a long time. Not because she was afraid of failing, but because she wasn't sure she belonged in that kind of space anymore. Still, the thought didn't disappear. Stayed there, steady and patient. And somewhere deep inside, something was slowly beginning to shift again. The thought stayed with her longer than she expected. Even the next morning, as she went through her usual routine, it didn't fade. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was steady, like a quiet knock that didn't go away. She tried to ignore it at first. While getting ready, she focused on small things. Straightening her clothes, adjusting her bag, making sure everything was in place. These were the habits that kept her grounded, that kept her from thinking too much. But even then, the idea found its way back. That small gathering, that piano, that simple chance. She stepped outside and began walking as she always did. The streets were familiar, the sounds unchanged. But her mind wasn't as still as before. She found herself replaying the announcement in her head, remembering the casual way it had been said, as if it didn't matter. Anyone could try playing. The words sounded simple, almost too simple. At work, the day started like any other. People moved around her, focused on their own tasks. Conversations came and went. Some talked about the event again, but only briefly. A few joked about who might embarrass themselves on the piano. Others said they might try just for fun. No one mentioned her. She kept her head down, continuing her work as always. But this time she listened more carefully. Not to join in, but to understand how others saw it. To them, it was nothing serious. Just a moment. Just a simple tune. That thought stayed with her. As the hours passed, she noticed something about herself. Every time the idea came back, she didn't push it away as quickly as before. Instead, she let it stay for a moment longer. She allowed herself to think about it, even if just a little. What would happen if she sat at that piano? The question felt unfamiliar. She wasn't used to thinking about stepping into the center of anything. For so long, she had stayed at the edges, comfortable in the quiet space where no one expected anything from her. But now something was different. By the time the day ended, she felt a quiet tension inside her. Not fear exactly, but a kind of uncertainty that made her pause before every decision. When she returned home, she didn't go straight to the keyboard like she had been doing. Instead, she sat on the chair near the window, looking out into the evening. The sky was slowly turning darker, and the street below was calm. A few people passed by, their footsteps soft and distant. Everything felt still. She sat there for a long time. Her thoughts moved slowly, circling around the same question again and again. She tried to imagine herself at that gathering, sitting in front of people, placing her hands on a piano that wasn't hers. The image didn't feel comfortable, but it didn't feel impossible either. That was new. After a while, she stood up and walked toward the corner of the room. She removed the cloth from the keyboard and sat down. This time, her movements were more thoughtful, more aware. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first few notes were soft, but there was a difference in the way she played. There was more focus, more intention behind each sound. It wasn't just about remembering anymore. It was about understanding what she could do now. She played the same simple tune she had been practicing, but she paid closer attention to every detail. The timing, the pressure of her fingers, the flow of the melody. When she made a mistake, she stopped and started again. Not with frustration, but with patience. Again and again, she repeated small parts, trying to make them smoother, more natural. It wasn't about perfection. It was about feeling ready. Time passed without her noticing. The room filled with quiet music, soft and steady. Her hands moved more freely, more confidently. The hesitation that had once been there was slowly fading. At one point, She stopped playing and looked down at the keys. There was a quiet realization in that moment. She wasn't the same person who had left this behind years ago. She had changed. But the connection to music hadn't disappeared. It had only been waiting. That thought stayed with her. Later that evening, as she prepared to rest, she found herself thinking about the gathering again. This time, the idea didn't feel as distant. It still made her unsure, but there was something else there now. A small sense of possibility. The next day, the topic came up again at work. This time, it was more organized. A simple list was placed where people could write their names if they wanted to participate. It wasn't a big announcement, just a small step. She noticed it as she passed by. Her steps slowed. For a moment, she stood there, looking at the list. A few names were already written. Some were added casually, with laughter and light conversation. Others were written with hesitation. She stayed quiet. Her eyes moved over the paper, but she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Someone nearby made a comment about how easy it would be. "It's just a simple tune," they said. "Nothing to worry about." She heard it clearly. Just a simple tune. The words echoed in her mind. She walked away without saying anything. But something inside her had shifted again. That evening, she returned home with a different kind of energy. It wasn't excitement, but it wasn't the usual calm either. It felt like standing at the edge of something unknown. She went straight to the keyboard. This time she didn't start slowly. Her fingers moved with more confidence, more strength. The melody flowed more naturally, and the pauses felt intentional. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She played the tune from beginning to end. Then she played it again, and again. Each time it felt a little stronger, a little clearer. When she finally stopped, she sat still for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. Her hands rested lightly on the keys. There was no one there to hear her, no one to judge. And yet, for the first time, she imagined what it would be like if someone did. The thought didn't make her step away. It made her think. Slowly, she closed the keyboard and stood up. The room felt quiet, but not empty. There was something building, something she couldn't fully explain yet. That night, she didn't lie awake for long. But before she fell asleep, one thought came back, clearer than before. Maybe it wasn't about being ready. Maybe it was about trying. The next morning would come like all the others. But now there was a decision waiting. And this time, she knew she wouldn't be able to ignore it for much longer. The morning came quietly, but it didn't feel ordinary anymore. She woke up before the alarm, her eyes opening into a still room filled with soft early light. For a few seconds, she didn't move. She simply lay there, aware of one thing that hadn't been there before. A decision. It wasn't fully formed, and it wasn't loud, but it was there, waiting for her to either accept it or turn away again. She sat up slowly, her feet touching the floor with the same calm rhythm she always carried. But inside, there was a gentle tension, like something pulling her forward. She didn't rush. She never did. Instead, she moved through her routine with quiet focus, as if every small action mattered more than usual. When she stepped outside, the air felt fresh, and the streets were just beginning to fill with people. Everything looked the same, but her thoughts were not. They circled around one place, one moment that hadn't happened yet. That list, that simple opportunity. As she walked, she noticed her steps were slightly slower than usual. Not because she was tired, but because she was thinking. She passed by the same shops, the same corners, the same faces, but she didn't feel as distant from everything as before. She felt present. At work, the day began like any other, but there was a quiet awareness in her movements. She knew where the list was placed. She knew she would pass by it at some point, and she knew that when she did, she wouldn't be able to pretend it didn't matter. Time moved steadily. She focused on her tasks, keeping her hands busy, her mind steady. But the thought stayed with her. It didn't interrupt her work, but it didn't leave either. Then, without planning it, she found herself walking toward that part of the room. The list was still there. A few more names had been added since yesterday. Some written neatly, others quickly, as if the person hadn't thought too much before writing. People passed by it without much attention. It was just a piece of paper to them. To her, it felt different. She stopped a few steps away. Her eyes rested on the paper, then shifted slightly, as if she was giving herself a chance to walk away. No one was watching her closely. No one expected anything from her. She could leave and nothing would change. For a brief moment she almost did. But then, something inside her refused to step back. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't certainty. It was something quieter. A simple decision not to run from the chance. She took a step forward. Her hand moved slowly, almost carefully, as if she didn't want to draw attention. She picked up the pen. It felt heavier than it should have, or maybe it was just the weight of the moment. She looked at the list one more time. Then, without overthinking it, she wrote her name. The moment was small. No one reacted. No one paused or looked up. But for her, it felt like something had shifted in a way she couldn't undo. She placed the pen back and stepped away, her heart beating slightly faster than usual. Not out of fear, but because she had finally done something she had been holding back for so long. She didn't stay there. She returned to her work, her movements steady again. But her mind now carried a new awareness. It was real now. She had chosen to be part of it. The rest of the day passed in a quiet blur. She completed everything she needed to do, spoke when necessary, and kept her usual calm presence. But beneath that calm, there was a growing sense of something approaching. Not something to fear, something to face. When she returned home that evening, she didn't pause by the window. She didn't sit and think for long. Instead, she went straight to the keyboard. This time, there was no hesitation. She uncovered it, sat down, and placed her hands on the keys with a quiet sense of purpose. The first note came out clearer than before. She began to play the tune she had been practicing. It was still simple, just as the event required. But now she played it with more attention, more care. Every note mattered. Every pause had meaning. She repeated it again and again. Not out of pressure, but out of a desire to understand it fully. To feel comfortable with it, not just in her room, but in herself. At times, her fingers slowed when doubt crept in. What if she forgot something? What if her hands didn't move the same way in front of others? The thoughts came, but they didn't stay for long. Each time, she took a breath and continued. The more she played, the more those doubts softened. They didn't disappear, but they became quieter, replaced by something steadier. By the time she stopped, the room was filled with a calm silence that felt earned. She leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't perfect, but she was ready to try. That night, she didn't feel the same uncertainty as before. There was still a sense of the unknown, but it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like standing at the beginning of something, not knowing exactly where it would lead, but being willing to take the first step. The day of the gathering came sooner than she expected. It wasn't a large event, just a simple space, a small group of people, and a quiet setup meant for light moments. The piano stood at the center, waiting. When she arrived, she kept to herself just as she always did. She found a place to stand where she wouldn't draw attention. People talked around her, some laughing, others casually watching. Names were called one by one. Each person stepped forward, played briefly, and stepped away. Some made small mistakes and laughed them off. Others played confidently, enjoying the moment. The atmosphere was relaxed. That helped. But as her turn got closer, she felt her heart begin to beat faster. Her hands, usually so steady, felt slightly tense. She looked at the piano from a distance, noticing how different it felt compared to the one in her room. It looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. When her name was finally called, everything around her seemed to quiet down, even if only in her mind. For a brief second, she didn't move. Then she took a step forward, and then another. Her walk was calm, but each step carried weight. Not from the people around her, but from the moment itself. She reached the piano and sat down. The seat felt unfamiliar. The space felt open. She could feel the presence of others, even without looking directly at them. She knew they were watching, waiting, expecting something simple. She placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she didn't play. She took a slow breath, closed her eyes, and let the noise around her fade away. In that quiet space, it wasn't about the room anymore. It wasn't about the people. It wasn't even about the event. It was just her, and the music she had found again after all this time. Her fingers pressed the first note, and everything began to change. The first note settled into the room more gently than anyone expected. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't demand attention, but it carried something quiet and steady, something that made people pause without knowing why. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer after that first note. Not because she was afraid to look up, but because she wanted to stay in that space where everything felt simple, where it was just her and the keys beneath her fingers. Then the next note followed, and another. The melody began to take shape, slowly at first, like a story finding its voice. It was the same simple tune she had practiced over and over again in her small room. The same notes, the same structure. But now, something about it felt different. It wasn't just a tune anymore. It was a feeling. Her fingers moved carefully, but not stiffly. There was a softness in the way she played, a quiet control that didn't come from trying to impress anyone. It came from understanding the music in her own way. The room began to change. At first, there were a few small sounds. A chair shifting slightly, someone whispering. But those sounds faded as the melody continued. One by one, people grew still. Conversations stopped. Even those who hadn't been paying much attention before began to look toward the piano. There was something about the way she played that made it hard to ignore. It wasn't fast or complex. It didn't rely on show or skill that needed to be proven. Instead, it carried a kind of honesty that felt rare. Each note flowed into the next without force, without hesitation. She didn't rush. She didn't try to make it bigger than it was. She simply let it be. Her hands moved more freely now. The tension that had been there when she first sat down was gone. In its place was something steadier, something grounded. As the melody grew, so did the feeling behind it. There were small shifts in the way she played, slight changes in rhythm, gentle pauses that felt natural rather than planned. It was as if she was telling a story without words, letting the music carry what she couldn't say out loud. Somewhere in the room, one of the judges leaned forward slightly, not out of surprise but out of curiosity. This was not what they had expected from someone who had stepped up so quietly, without any sign of confidence or experience. Another judge exchanged a brief glance, their expression changing in a subtle but clear way. They were listening now, not just hearing the notes, but paying attention. The audience felt it too. There was a shift in the air, something that made the moment feel more focused, more present. People who had been relaxed and casual before were now still, their attention drawn fully to the sound filling the space. She didn't see any of it. Her focus remained on the music. Her eyes stayed softly closed, her breathing steady. The world around her had faded into the background. There was no pressure, no expectation, no awareness of being watched. Only the melody. As she moved into the middle of the tune, something deeper began to come through. The notes carried more weight now, more emotion. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, honest way that felt real. It was as if the music held pieces of her story. Moments of silence, of patience, of things left unspoken. Her fingers pressed the keys with just enough strength, never too much, never too little. Every sound had its place. There were no wasted movements, no unnecessary effort, just flow. The simplicity of the tune became its strength. What could have been ordinary felt meaningful. What could have been forgettable became something people wanted to hold on to for just a little longer. A person near the back of the room shifted slightly, leaning forward with their hands resting together. Their expression had softened, their focus completely on the piano. Another person, who had earlier been looking at their phone, had now set it aside without realizing it. The room was quiet in a way that felt full, not empty. As the melody moved toward its final part, she slowed slightly. Not because she was unsure, but because she understood the moment. She let the notes breathe, giving each one space before moving to the next. There was a calm confidence in her playing now. Not the kind that comes from wanting approval, but the kind that comes from being present, from being honest. The final sequence approached, and her hands moved with a gentle certainty. The tune returned to where it had begun, simple and soft, like a quiet circle closing. The last few notes were played with care. Then came the final one. She let it linger just a moment longer before lifting her fingers away. And then, there was silence. Not the kind that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that comes when no one wants to break what they just felt. For a brief moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the room needed a second to catch up, to fully understand what had just happened. Then, slowly, the reaction began. Started small. A single clap, then another, and then more. Within seconds, the sound grew into something fuller, something stronger. Applause filled the room, not loud in a chaotic way, but steady and genuine. The judges looked at each other again, but this time, there was no confusion in their expressions. Only a quiet understanding that they had witnessed something unexpected. One of them nodded slightly, almost to themselves. Another leaned back, still watching her, as if trying to place where that kind of playing had come from. She opened her eyes. For a brief second, she looked almost unsure, as if she had stepped out of a quiet space and into something unfamiliar. The sound of the applause reached her slowly, and she blinked, taking it in. She didn't smile widely. She didn't react in a big way. But there was a softness in her expression, a calm awareness that something had changed. She stood up carefully, her movements still gentle, still grounded. For a moment, she looked at the piano. Then she stepped away. As she walked back, the applause continued for a few seconds more before fading. People watched her differently now, not with doubt or curiosity, but with a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. She returned to her place quietly, just as she had always been. But everything felt different, not because the room had changed, but because she had. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The music had already spoken, and for the first time in a long while it had been heard. The sound of applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind did not disappear. It stayed in the room, quiet but strong, like something that had settled into the air. People returned to their seats, some whispering softly, others still looking toward the piano as if trying to understand what they had just experienced. She stood where she had returned, her hands resting calmly by her sides. Her breathing had slowed again, and her expression was steady, but inside, something had shifted in a way she could not fully describe. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't shock. It was something deeper. A quiet understanding that a part of her life she thought was gone had just come back, not in a small way, but in a way that could not be ignored anymore. She didn't try to hold on to the attention. In fact, she gently stepped a little further back, allowing the event to continue as if nothing unusual had happened. Other names were called and other people stepped forward. Some played with energy, some with nervous laughter, and some with simple confidence. But the room was not the same. There was a change in the way people listened now. A little more carefully, a little more quietly, and every now and then, someone would glance in her direction. Not with curiosity anymore, but with respect. The judges continued observing each performance, but there was a subtle difference in their expressions. They were still focused, still professional, but something about their earlier reaction remained. It showed in the way they leaned forward slightly, in the way they listened more closely than before. When the event finally came to an end, there was no loud announcement or dramatic conclusion. It was simple, just like it had been from the beginning. People began to stand, to talk, to slowly move toward the exit. She waited a moment before moving. She didn't want to draw attention. She didn't feel the need to speak to anyone or explain anything. What had happened on that stage was enough. But as she turned to leave, one of the judges stepped forward. It wasn't sudden or overwhelming. It was a calm, respectful approach. She paused. For a brief moment, she wondered if she should keep walking, but something told her to stay. The judge spoke in a quiet tone, not loud enough for others to hear clearly. There were no big words, no dramatic praise, just a simple acknowledgement. They said that what she had done was not just playing. It was feeling. And that was something rare. She listened without interrupting, her expression calm as always. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded slightly. It wasn't a moment for long conversations. The judge gave a small smile and stepped back, allowing her to go. And she did. She walked out of the space the same way she had walked in, quietly, without drawing attention. But each step felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter, just more certain. Outside, the evening air felt calm. The world continued as it always did. People moved along the streets, conversations carried on, and nothing seemed to have changed. But for her, everything had. As she walked home, she didn't rush. She let her steps match the steady rhythm she had always known. But her thoughts were no longer distant or quiet in the same way. They were clear. For so long, she had lived without asking herself what she truly wanted. She had followed what life placed in front of her, moving from one day to the next without questioning it. But now something had opened. Not a sudden path, not a loud direction, just a simple truth. She had something within her that mattered, and she had felt it again. When she reached her room, she stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The familiar space greeted her in its usual stillness. The chair by the window, the shelf, the quiet air. It was all the same. And in the corner, the keyboard waited. She walked toward it slowly. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at it. It no longer felt like something from the past. It didn't feel forgotten or left behind. It felt present. She uncovered it and sat down. Her hands rested on her lap, not rushing to play. She took a breath and allowed the silence to settle around her. Then, gently, she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note sounded soft, just like before. But this time it carried something new. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, but acceptance. She began to play not because she needed to practice, not because she had something to prove, but because she wanted to. The melody flowed naturally. There were no thoughts about who might hear it. No questions about whether it was enough. Just the music. As she played, she realized something simple but important. She didn't need a stage. She didn't need an audience. Those things might come or they might not. What mattered was that she had found something real again. Something she had once lost. And now she wasn't going to let it slip away. Time passed quietly, and when she finally stopped, the room felt full in a way it never had before. She leaned back slightly, her eyes resting on the keys. There was no rush to move, no pressure to decide what came next. But there was a quiet understanding that things would not stay the same. In the days that followed, small changes began to appear. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwhelming, just simple shifts. She continued her routine, still waking early, still going to work, still living her life in the same steady way. But now there was space for something more. Every evening she played, not out of habit but out of choice. Sometimes the tunes were simple, sometimes they were new, sometimes she made mistakes, and sometimes she surprised herself. People at her workplace began to notice small differences, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the way she carried herself. There was a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She still didn't speak much. She still stayed out of the center, but she no longer felt invisible, because she knew something others didn't. She knew what she was capable of. Opportunities didn't suddenly appear all at once. There were no dramatic offers or life-changing moments waiting for her the next day. But there were small chances. A suggestion here, an invitation there. Nothing too big. Nothing too far from what she could handle. And this time she didn't turn away from them so quickly. She took her time. She chose carefully. And when she stepped forward, she did it in her own quiet way. Months later, if someone had asked her what changed, she might not have had a clear answer. Because from the outside, her life still looked simple. Still calm. Still quiet. But inside, everything was different. She had found something she didn't even realize she was missing. And more importantly, she had allowed herself to keep it. That single moment at the piano had not turned her into someone else. It had simply brought her back to who she had always been. And this time, she wasn't going to forget it. The world around her continued as it always would. Busy, loud, and often too fast. But she had found her own rhythm within it. Soft, steady, and real. And that was more than enough.